Are you looking to stay ahead of the curve in the latest trends in enterprise tech? Look no further than the Breaking Analysis podcast with Dave Vellante. This data-driven program dives into the most important topics facing the enterprise tech industry today. With a data-first approach that leverages ETR's renowned surveys of IT decision-makers and insight from the CUBE community, Breaking Analysis delivers in-depth research on the most important topics facing technologists and IT buyers. Whether you're a business leader, an IT professional, investor, or just an avid follower of the industry, this podcast is a must-listen. Just search Breaking Analysis Podcast wherever you get your podcast and tune in today to stay ahead of the game in enterprise tech.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to The Cloudcast. We're coming to you live from our massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. And it is Aaron for a couple of quick announcements, and then we're going to jump right into our main interview this week. If you listen to the Sunday show, you've already heard I had a big event this weekend. I actually went and ran the Marine Corps Marathon in Washington, D.C. this weekend, and I am sore. But probably the part you care about, I haven't had a chance to keep up with cloud news over the last week or so. So no cloud news this week. And because of that, I'm just going to simply say, for those of you that are attending KubeCon next week, let us know. I would love to be there and meet some folks. I'm going to be there for the entire week. Would love to hear from the guests, hear from the listeners, and any feedback you have. Also, as mentioned on the Sunday show, we're potentially playing around with what the format of the show a little bit and the future direction. And we would love to hear feedback either directly or indirectly on that as well. So with that, I'm going to close out the announcements section. And coming up right after the break, we're going to be talking to Tim Miller from Cisco about new ways to approach the security challenges that are created by both cloud native and multi-cloud.
Are you getting pressure from finance to justify or reduce your cloud bill? CloudZero is the only cloud cost platform loved by engineers and trusted by finance. CloudZero can identify unused, idle, or over-provisioned resources, alert you to spend anomalies, and organize 100% of your spend into a framework that mirrors your business structure, like cost per customer, product feature, or team. It's the most powerful platform ever built to provide accurate, granular visibility into your total cloud spend without the typical pitfalls of legacy cloud cost management tools like endless tagging or clunky Kubernetes support. Manage cost, optimize development, and maximize profit, all in one platform. Join companies like Rapid7, Drift, and SeatGeek by visiting cloudzero.com/cloudcast to get started. That's cloudzero.com/cloudcast. Visit today to experience immediate and ongoing savings on your cloud bill. And we're back. And folks, one of the things that we hear over and over again from you, the audience, the community, is as you're learning more and more about how to build modern applications, as you're starting to deploy to the cloud, as you're dealing with multiple types of environments, whether it's still on premises or, you're in Cloud 1 or Cloud 2, wherever you might be, we constantly sort of get this, hey, all the technologies are sort of interesting, but the more we're doing stuff with distributed applications or microservices, or we're in multiple clouds, like things are getting more complicated, especially around security. And while we've, talked about a lot of different things on this show over time, or the last year, or the last couple of years about security, there's always sort of a feeling of like, are we applying kind of old time approaches to these sort of new challenges and new problems? And so today we're going to get a chance to really look at some more cutting edge ways that people are trying to, solve this problem of how do I, take advantage of all the really interesting things that cloud brings to us, that microservices brings to us, that helps us build more modern applications, helps our business get into new things faster. But also, how do we deal with sort of the security ramifications of more moving parts, more things, more attack vectors, and so forth. And so, really, really excited today to have Tim Miller, technical marketing engineer from Outshift by Cisco. Tim, welcome to the show. Great to have you on.
Oh, thanks, Brian. Appreciate you having me on here.
You and I are, we've been talking here before the break. You and I are both here in North Carolina, so it's always nice for us to have some folks from North Carolina. Before we dive into everything, why don't you give us a little bit of your background and then help us understand a little more of, I suspect everybody listening knows Cisco, but what is Outshift by Cisco?
Sure. So my history is quite interesting and varied, I should say. And I actually started out in academia. I've got a doctorate degree in physics, but where that comes into the story is, it was during a time where we were getting away from proprietary Unix platforms. So a long-time Linux user, I go back to Red Hat Linux days, and that is not Red Hat Enterprise Linux days. Those are Red Hat Linux days. For those out there that remember the Rembrandt distribution, that's way back in the early 90s. Yeah.
Back when it was in a box.
That's right. Yes. Shelfware. So I've been using Linux an extremely long period of time. And that, of course, throughout my career led to being a power user, sysadmin. The work I did as a graduate student required a lot of computing and storage. So that led to an HPC system administrator role. Here at a local university, I created a centralized HPC environment there and brought together the undergraduate campus and the hospital systems research programs into a common platform. And from there, it just kept growing, right? The one thing I put in my Twitter bio that is humorous is been there, done that, got many conference T-shirts, conference swag, that sort of thing, because I like learning technology. I like doing things. I like seeing where the space goes. And that ultimately led me to Cisco, where I focused on the data center portfolio naturally. That was a natural evolution. And now I'm at this cool group called Outshift by Cisco. So Outshift by Cisco is chartered with bringing new technologies to market for Cisco and innovating in spaces that we normally aren't associated with. So the innovation that normally happens with our established products like firewalls, switches, computers, things like that, those groups handle that. But now we're talking about cloud, apropos to our conversation today. So we are focusing primarily on cloud native security and how to bring new ways of doing application security to Cisco, both to solve problems for our customers as well as to evolve Cisco.
Yeah, very, very cool. Yeah, and we love having guests on that both have had fairly significant hands-on background. They're not just sort of talking from theory or talking from vendor perspectives, and love the fact that you're just sort of outwardly like, look, man, I like learning new stuff. That's been the cornerstone of this show since day one. So we're gonna have a good time. Let's start by talking a little bit about security challenges. Your focus these days around kind of this big intersection of security challenges, modern applications, multiple clouds. How do you sort of think about, rationalize the security challenges in these sort of new, more dynamic, more agile environments?
Well, there's a couple foundational problems or challenges that come to mind. One is, you mentioned multiple clouds. So my application is in a lot of places, right?
Absolutely.
We've broken it up into microservices so that one application is also split up into multiple regions, availability zones, and that sort of thing. So I've got parts and pieces everywhere that have to communicate and coordinate and sync up and provide each other component in the system to information in order to serve a need that users like you and me need to get out of those applications. So lots of moving parts all over the place. And most of these applications aren't really written top to bottom with my software. I don't have developers writing the code to go from, creating a packet all the way up to, processing the information that came across that payload. I'm a Python aficionado. So when I write a proof of concept kind of web application, I'm using the request module, right? That was written by a whole other host of volunteers out there that put together a great package. And so I'm going to leverage that stuff that's out there. So I'm putting them to all these parts and pieces together like a great big Lego ship. I've got It's unfortunate this is audio only because you can't see the massive collection of Legos behind me. But yeah, I'm basically taking the wonderful open source Legos that the internet has provided and bringing it together in unique ways. And the challenge is how do I know that stuff's secure, right?
Right. Right. Yeah, it's it's a little bit like going to the grocery store and being like, well, I can grab a bunch of stuff and make a meal, but if you're not spending all day long looking at the ingredients, understanding everything, knowing the supply chain of how that avocado got into your guacamole, it just takes one thing, right? And we've seen attacks happen because one seemingly small piece of code became very vulnerable. So yeah, no, absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah. The classic challenge of security, and we hear this all the time, is there's never sort of one silver bullet. If you talk to any organization, any company, they've got multiple dozens, maybe hundreds of security tools. That leaves a lot of possibility of misconfiguration. While there's great technology usually embedded within them, are the people working on them, are they up to speed on it? So there's, it's like people tell us all the time, the folks that are burdened with the challenge of securing environments for their company, for their organization, the odds are stacked against them because the bad guys only have to find one vulnerability. They have to protect sort of all of them. Are there new approaches? Because it feels like, one of those things. I know security people get frustrated. They always feel like the odds are stacked against them. Are there new approaches that are starting to emerge that might, get us back to somewhat of a level playing field, or maybe give security teams somewhat of an upper hand at times?
There are. To sum up the challenges you just mentioned, it's all about silos, right? I've got these dozens or hundreds of tools or techniques that I'm throwing together. But it's all siloed. They're not related. If we spend some effort, we can correlate that on our own if we want. But the reality is security teams are too small and too overwhelmed to do that. And it requires a lot of expertise. So it's the emerging trend right now, to your point, is we've got to put all of this information together in a common place, store all the context related to these items in one place, provide all that correlation so that we can then make meaningful discoveries without having to stitch all this information together by hand every time we go to look and go to ask questions of that information. Yeah. And so, one approach we like to take is using a graph database to store that. So we take all those relationships, we've modeled different attack vectors, different ways that attackers can take your environment, and we store the data in the database in natural ways to discover potential attack. We call them attack paths. So we take that approach to really try and find new ways of compromising your environment, not just ways that we may have been burned on before.
Yeah, yeah. And when you say bringing that data together, you're not necessarily sort of replacing every tool. I suspect you're saying, like, I've got to be able to bring data from intrusion detection tools and firewall logs and things, bring those into more centralized places where you can get a holistic view of things. Is that kind of the thought process, or something else?
No, that's exactly it. The more context and the more coverage, or I guess coverage would be a good word for that. The more coverage and the more context you can get, the better. And quite frankly, the challenge is there's tons of tools, but the reality is there's tons of great open source tools to do some of these point analyses. Anchor Project has Sift and Gripe. There's Trivy, there's SemGrep, right? There's all these great open source projects out there. It makes little sense to reinvent the wheel. It makes a whole lot more sense to bring it together intelligently and get a whole lot of useful correlatable data out of it so that we can then really pinpoint where the security risks are.
Interesting. It's fascinating to me. You and I were sort of sharing stories and comparing stuff before. I was at Cisco sort of in the 90s and the early 2000s, and the concept of Cisco people openly talking about open source and putting just real quick. I'm kind of taking it aside. Help me understand the open source mindset within Cisco. Like how much leeway does the Outshift group have to use open source, or what's your philosophy around open source?
Oh, we are big supporters of open source, and that might be of a surprise to you and your listeners. The Open Telemetry project, one that a lot of observability folks that might be listening are very familiar with. We're one of the biggest contributors to that, as I recall. So we do have, and it's admittedly it's focused, right? Historically, to your point, a lot of the open source was dependent on, let's call a spade, if it drove sales.
Sure.
But at Outshift by Cisco, we actually have a freer view of it. We're taking and really investing into that space. Panoptica has open source projects that back it, that we have sponsored. So the Open Clarity Suite, which I think we're going to provide a link in the notes for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that folks can listen to it or read about it rather. So we've got some of those projects that we've spun up and backed. We've submitted a couple to CNCF. Bank Faults is one that's under consideration, and Logging Operator, I think, is the other one that actually has been accepted. So we are contributing, we are giving back to the community, and at the same time, like I mentioned, leveraging some of those well-established, mature security tools out there like Sift and Gripe.
Interesting. Very cool to sort of hear about the evolution. Let me jump back to a little more of the focus as we were talking about these new ways to look at security. There's this concept that I know you're involved with called attack path analysis. Tell us about what is it? What is it trying to accomplish, and sort of what's it doing differently than people would have thought about in the past in terms of trying to prevent attacks?
Yeah, so it's really about taking an approach to your environment that an attacker would take, right? So an attacker is going to do some external recon, right? So they're sitting somewhere on the planet and they've targeted your domain as something they want to potentially exploit. So they're going to kind of do some reconnaissance. They're going to look up your domain. They're going to see if it's based on a cloud platform, probe it lightly, right, to see what's open. Is this a web server? Does it have OpenSSH? That sort of thing. And map out that external attack surface, right? And then from there, with just that light exploration, you can actually kind of glean off some CVEs they might be vulnerable to. And then once they get in, then it's, well, what do I see on this system that I just hacked, right? I may have gotten access to a VM via EC2 instance, right? Now I'm going to look at this node and see what's on it. I'm going to run, I'm going to check to see if I can put a rootkit on it. Can I exploit something? Do I find secrets on this thing? Oh, I found a secret. Oh, these are the next step is I've got access to, IAM keys, right? So then now what can I exploit in this cloud account? And do I have access to this database? And long story short, right, I'm walking through this path through your environment to get to the thing I care about, your data, so I can do ransomware, the ability to spin up EC2 instances or, EKS clusters to then crypto mine and make a killing off of it, right? So that path, that attacker mindset maps to the graph database technology that an approach that we take, and to the attack path analysis. So the whole point of doing this attack path analysis is to think like an attacker.
Interesting. So it's Yeah, it's almost you're not thinking in terms of kind of the traditional just put up roadblocks. You're really kind of thinking about kind of those two steps further of like, okay, so assume the normal stuff is in place. How would I constantly be thinking about getting around it? It's interesting. How does the system, from a usability perspective, like give us some sense? You're sitting in front of it. Like, what are you seeing? How are you? Like, what is the think like a hacker sort of look like from a technology perspective?
From a technology perspective, the idea is to get all this context in one spot, right? So when I look at an attack path that's been discovered, right, from a security engineer's perspective, I have to understand how the attacker is going to compromise me. So we present it visually, right? So we give you this nice visual representation of the path that was found in the graph. So it starts off with visibility, right? Visual cues to help me understand how the attacker is going to get me. And then we put the context around it, like for an EC2 instance, there's malware or there's a secret on here. In the cloud platform, there's a role attached to it that could be risky. So all of that is visualized and from the relationships that are stored in the graph database. And so the queries we use, these are really the special sauce and why attack path analysis it's critically depends on a graph database. And it's because it's not a specific search. And the difference between a query and a search is very important here. The best analogy would be to use getting from point A to point B, right? If we're here in North Carolina and we need to get to San Diego because we want better weather, it's starting to get cold here in North Carolina, right? So maybe we want the better weather of San Diego. In the olden days, we get out state maps. We get out, we go down to the store and get an atlas, right? And just look at all the maps and stitch together a path ourselves. And for the most part, that works. But then you have to know which roads are closed, right? Where the speed traps are, which one of these roads are toll. So I have to reroute around that. And so the old way or the search way of doing it is doing all these independent queries for all these independent data. Even though they may be in the same platform, they're almost always in separate tables, separate databases. And so these massive queries and massive joins are costly. They're fraught with peril because they tend to have, coming back to the security analogy, lots of false positives, right? Whereas our way of doing it is really kind of the Google Maps way, like source, destination, give me the map. And Google has it all stored already. And so it's really just ask the graph, what is the path with these conditions attached to it? And the nodes that, and this is a path through space, right? And through the graph. And so there are nodes and lines that connect them. But there are conditions on each one of those nodes. And if, they don't match, they don't end up in that point A to point B destination in the graph. And so it's a very efficient query. It's very reliable, and it really cuts down on the false positives.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, no, it's a much bigger picture. I feel like to a certain extent, it's kind of, may or may not be the best analogy, but it's kind of the way that, people talk about, we've used search for forever, and search is fantastic. It comes back and it gives us options, but it doesn't necessarily always give us results. And now we're seeing, we're now seeing some of this sort of large language model, generative AI, where you're sort of like, well, I don't want a bunch of options. Just, give me results, kind of give me a path. And it seems fairly similar. And I think that's a lot of that feels like what you're highlighting with, the fact that the things are graph based. You're not looking for sort of the next step. You're looking for all the steps, and you're sort of looking for completeness of what it might look like, the bigger picture.
Right. And those searches, when they return results, they're returning exactly what you're looking for, or what you asked for is probably the better way to put it. Whereas the general graph query is basically a much looser ask, right? It's not so strict on what you're looking for. You give it general attack path language of a public workload that might have malware, or might have a compromise of some sort, and then privilege escalation, or maybe even just define it as a risky role. And then from that simple set of 2 or 3 constraints, all these different attack paths or ways that an attacker can compromise your environment come out of that simple ask. Whereas if I'm saying I need a specific VM that has malware and has admin compromise, I have to go and write all of those 7 or 8 attack paths that come out of that for a search. So I can be much more free in the ask and get a much wider range of results out of it, and things that I may not even consider. And that's the important part.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. You work with a platform called Panoptica. Tell us a bit about Panoptica and how it sort of fits into this bigger picture that we've been talking about. How it fits in with infrastructure as code and CI and CD and observability.
Yeah, Panoptica is our platform for cloud native application security. So that's the buzzword, right? And so we are leveraging at the heart this attack path analysis technology. And as we mentioned earlier, it's all about providing as much coverage as we can get. So as many different security domains. Because going back to the very first thing we talked about, what are the challenges here? There's so many ways a cloud native application can be compromised. The attack surface and the number of attack vectors has just exploded. And so we're focused on bringing together as many domains as we can and integrating them into the graph. And that's the most important part, because again, everything we've talked about here. So Panoptica brings together what's called Cloud Security Posture Management, CSPM. We've got workload protection, or CWP. We've got the IAC scanning and CI/CD capabilities. We have API security, right? And so we're bringing together both configuration-based information, that's the CSPM and CWP and all the IAC from the repositories, all those artifacts that at one point will define your environment, deploy your application, but also things that look into the real-time aspects of your application, the API communication security, events, right, that are getting generated. So we are looking at anomalous events that are occurring in your environment and alerting on them, right? And so we're just trying to do this in a way that is as frictionless as possible. So we don't necessarily want to embed software into your application. We want to connect into this. And to date, we have primarily been agentless. So we connect into your cloud account. We deploy an application into your Kubernetes cluster, and we gather all this configuration and running state information. And we're about to expand. And I should say the API security is a similar application that we deploy into your environment to collect all the tracing and traffic information that goes through, and then process all that information, store it into a graph, and provide you an analysis of where an attacker can compromise you. And we do this, from the security perspective. So the SecOps person who needs to get a snapshot or a view of what their environment's like. For the CISO, we've got compliance frameworks that they can look at to look at this scorecard and see how well they match up against PCI and GDPR and so forth. And for the developer out there, the CI/CD parts of this, we've got the vulnerability assessments for container images and serverless. We've got the API security. So there's specification analysis, fuzz testing that we can do in the pipeline. Just a lot of rich capabilities to broaden that coverage and provide the most comprehensive way of looking at an application and securing it, because that attack surface is massive.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I want to ask you sort of one last question as you're thinking about this, and obviously, maybe think about this from a practitioner's perspective. Plenty of teams out there, DevOps teams, DevSecOps teams. What, if you were trying to describe to them like how their world looks a little bit different, taking this attack path analysis approach, maybe as opposed to what they were doing previously, or maybe even what they're doing today, like, how is their world going to be somewhat different? Maybe what types of skills do they need to start bringing to the picture, or what does their world sort of look like if they start trying to take this approach?
So I for anybody that's heard me talk, they'll probably get tired of hearing me say this. I have this line I use because it's humorous. Security companies have a perverse incentive to give you lots of red, right? The more red, the more findings I can give you, the better I must be, because look at all the stuff I found, right? So everybody out there that is in this space that's looking towards what we're doing with attack path analysis, the biggest difference they're going to find is a relief kind, honestly, because we're not giving you, while the information is there, those thousands and thousands of risk findings that are red, hundreds of CVEs that are all scored 9.8, that information's all there, but it's boiled down into a dozen or maybe 24 of these attack paths that they have to look at. So they're going to get a lot of relief from the chaos and the noise of thousands and thousands of critical findings, many of which can't be exploited. And so the 20 or so attack paths that those thousands of risk findings may result in, is a relief, because it's not overwhelming, right? And it's to the point. There's clear explanations of what's going on. We do dynamic remediation recommendations. So for where it makes sense, we'll provide suggestions on how to remediate it. So the knowledge gap of this new thing the development team started, this new service in AWS that the development team started using, I don't know anything about that. We're going to provide those recommendations to point you in the right direction. And then ultimately, having all this information is great, but how do you act on it, right?
Yeah.
Security teams don't fix code.
Right.
So what we do is we integrate with the developer toolkit. So Jira, ServiceNow. And so we'll help the SecOps team, the DevSecOps team, submit all that information through those integrations right into the ticketing system. And rather than being the classic 20-page PDF you throw over the wall via email and say, fix this, right? It's, here's the problem we see. Here's the context that goes with it. Here's why we think this is a problem. Let's have a conversation about how we fix it. And then from the developer side, they can prioritize it right in their existing tools and move it along, split it up, et cetera. And so it's a much more friendly, less adversarial approach to it.
Nice. I like that. Less red lets you go to bed, or less red lets you go get fed. I like the idea of less red. Less trying to figure out which of those reds are really bad and which ones are false positives and which ones are, could be yellow or whatever. So no, I like that. Well, Tim, I'm going to wrap it up there. It's been good to dig into this stuff. Like I said, the thing we were really interested was, are there new approaches that are out there to try and help the teams that are responsible for trying to keep things safe, keep data safe, keep systems safe. And it's good to hear that there are new approaches out there now and on the horizon. So if anybody wanted to reach out to you or, kind of get engaged with the stuff that you're working on, what are some of the best ways to do that?
Yeah, well, to engage in a conversation, on the internet, I have my Twitter handle is @BroadcastStorm. It goes back to my networking days. So you can reach out to me there. Otherwise, if you'd like to learn more about the product, panoptica.app is the website. And we've got a way to, click a button to request a demo. Of course, you can try it out for free. And we've got, being part of Cisco, we give regular presentations at Cisco Live. So sessions on Panoptica are available on the Cisco Live on-demand library. So you'd be able to check out the information there. And we're starting up the YouTube channel finally. I'll say it's a little overdue, but we wanted to have that cool Outshift by Cisco look to it. So that took a little bit longer to spin up. So hopefully there'll be some YouTube videos showing up there shortly.
Nice. Very nice. Yeah. It's always good to throw in a broken spanning tree reference anytime you get a chance. So appreciate that. Well, good. With that, folks, I want to thank Tim for his time. Really, really appreciate, sharing some knowledge with us, opening the doors for us to some new things. We appreciate that. Thank you all for listening every week. We really appreciate it. We appreciate those of you that have been giving us feedback, both on, wherever you listen to your podcast, whether that's Apple or Spotify or Google or however. Those of you who've been sending us notes for suggestions, really appreciate it. We're working to get through those as quickly as we can. But thank you all for listening. Thanks for helping us spread the word. Tell a friend, helping us grow the show, and we will talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.